Daniel Kahneman's Heuristics and Biases. Daniel Kahneman, along with his collaborator Amos Tversky, changed the way we understand human thinking and decision-making. For a long time, it was assumed that people are mostly rational beings who carefully weigh pros and cons before making a choice. Economic theories in particular were built on the idea that people make logical decisions that serve their best interests. But Kahneman showed us that the reality is much more complicated. Human beings often rely on mental shortcuts, called heuristics, to make decisions quickly. While these shortcuts can be useful, they also lead to predictable mistakes in judgment, which are called biases. His work on heuristics and biases opened up an entirely new field of behavioral economics and psychology, revealing how our minds really work in everyday life. Heuristics can be thought of as mental rules of thumb. Instead of calculating every detail when making a choice, the brain uses shortcuts to save time and effort. For example, if you are deciding whether to buy a product, you might assume that a higher-priced item is of better quality. This may be true sometimes, but not always. That assumption is a heuristic. It helps you make a decision quickly, but it can also lead you to spend more money without actually getting a better product. Kahneman explained that these mental shortcuts often make sense in many situations, but they are far from perfect. One of the most common heuristics Kahneman identified is the availability heuristic. This is when people judge the likelihood of something based on how easily examples come to mind. For instance, if you recently saw a news story about a plane crash, you might think that flying is very dangerous, even though statistically it is much safer than driving a car. The vivid memory of the crash is available in your mind, so it feels more frequent or likely than it actually is. This shows how our perception of risk is shaped not by facts, but by what our memory highlights for us. Another heuristic is the representativeness heuristic. This occurs when people judge something based on how much it resembles their mental picture of a category. For example, if you meet a quiet, bookish person, you might assume they are more likely to be a librarian than a salesperson. But in reality, there are far more salespeople than librarians, so the probability is much higher that the person works in sales. The brain ignores this statistical reality and instead goes with the stereotype. Kahneman pointed out that while this shortcut feels natural, it leads to systematic errors when we ignore the base rates, which are the actual frequencies of events. The anchoring effect is another important bias discovered by Kahneman. This happens when people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they see, even if it is irrelevant. For example, if you are negotiating the price of a car, and the seller starts with a very high number, that number becomes an anchor. Even if you negotiate down, your final price is likely to be much higher than if the seller had started with a lower number. The initial figure strongly influences the outcome, even if you consciously know it should not. Anchoring shows how our decisions are pulled toward numbers or ideas we are first exposed to, even when they are random. Kahneman also explored the bias of overconfidence. People tend to believe they know more than they really do, or that their judgments are more accurate than they actually are. For example, when asked to make predictions about stock prices, sports results, or political outcomes, people often express high confidence in their answers, even though their actual accuracy is poor. Overconfidence can lead to risky decisions because individuals underestimate the chance of being wrong. This is particularly dangerous in areas like business, medicine, and finance, where mistakes can have serious consequences. Another bias highlighted by Kahneman is loss aversion. People dislike losses much more strongly than they like equivalent gains. For example, losing $100 feels more painful than the happiness of gaining $100. This explains why people often avoid risks, even when the odds are in their favor. It also explains behaviors like holding on to failing investments because selling would mean realizing a loss. Loss aversion shows that our decisions are not based on pure logic, but on emotions and the way choices are framed. Kahneman's research also demonstrated that the way questions are framed changes our choices. This is known as the framing effect. For example, if a medical treatment is described as having a 90% survival rate, people are more likely to accept it than if it is described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though both mean the same thing. The positive frame feels safer, while the negative frame feels scarier. This shows that people do not respond to facts alone, but to the way those facts are presented. All of these heuristics and biases reveal that the human mind is not a perfect calculator. Instead, it is a quick but flawed problem solver that balances speed with accuracy. Most of the time, heuristics help us navigate daily life without being overwhelmed by too much information. But in important situations, like financial decisions, health choices, or policy making, these biases can lead us astray. Kahneman argued that being aware of these mental shortcuts is the first step toward making better decisions. By slowing down and examining our judgments more carefully, we can sometimes reduce the impact of biases. Kahneman's insights changed fields like economics, law, medicine, and even public policy. For example, governments use his research to design policies that nudge people toward better decisions, such as saving for retirement or eating healthier. Businesses use it to understand consumer behavior and design marketing strategies. His work even influences how juries are instructed in court to reduce bias in their decisions. In simple terms, Kahneman showed that our brains are wired for speed, not perfection. We take mental shortcuts all the time, and while they help us survive in a complex world, they also trick us into mistakes that we repeat over and over again. By studying these patterns, we can become more aware of when our intuition is misleading us, and we can learn to rely more on deliberate thinking when it really matters. If you enjoyed learning about Daniel Kahneman's ideas on heuristics and biases, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more content on psychology, sociology, and philosophy explained in simple words.